non-profit housing provider here on the island, says it struggles to get the money it needs to maintain existing housing stock, which means some much-needed units are sitting empty. CBC Victoria reporter Catherine Marlowe has been looking into this, and she joins me in studio this morning. Catherine, good morning.
Good morning, Gregor.
So we certainly do get a lot of announcements from the province about all the housing investments it's making. How did this story come to your attention?
Well, late last year, I got a tip about a couple in Victoria who both have disabilities and have been struggling for a decade to get the housing that actually suits their needs. So Sandra Hoff and her husband, David, live in an affordable housing operated by the nonprofit provider Pacifica. When they first moved there in 2013, they were told to take any available apartment, even though it wasn't accessible, just to get their foot in the door, and that they could transfer or get adaptations later. But they are still there, and it is still not fully accessible. Here's Sandra.
We tried getting our bathroom adapted for both of us, but I'm 4 feet tall. My husband is almost 6 feet. So they said, well, we can't really make adaptations for both of you in the one bathroom. So, and it got to the point where I was basically using the local rec center here to shower. I love swimming, and that is the exercise that I do. The last time I tried showering by myself, I actually ended up slipping and I broke my ankle, and my doctor said, this is ridiculous. What's happening with the transfer?
Now, Gregor, I should add that because she loves swimming, she goes to Crystal Pool to shower. Also not a reliable place to get into every day.
Yeah, right.
Now, the reason Sandra's story came to me last month was that they actually did get an offer to transfer last year to a new unit, first to a brand new building, but that unit didn't fit the motorized mobility devices that both she and her husband use. Then they got an offer of another unit in their current building, which was generally better, but it was carpeted. Now, that's a problem for two reasons. One, carpet is a difficult surface when you have mobility issues, but it's also harder to clean than an uncarpeted floor, which anyone would know. But when you use a wheelchair or a scooter to get around, you bring in a lot of dirt and mud. You don't take your shoes off when you get in the door, right? You're tracking stuff in. Sandra works at a school, so she's bringing playground stuff in all the time. Their current place is carpeted. She says the carpets are disgusting despite regular cleaning. They've given up trying to clean them. So she asked if they could have carpet removed before they moved into the new place. And this is where we get to today's part of the story. She was told that couldn't happen before the end of this fiscal year. Sandra also said that she knew of units sitting empty in her building, which she couldn't understand given the housing crisis we're in. So when I contacted Pacifica Housing to ask about this, the CEO, Carolina Ibarra, wouldn't comment on this situation specifically, as often happens, citing privacy, but she did say that Pacifica is struggling to renovate and make capital upgrades on its older housing stock because of the way that BC Housing handles its budgeting. Okay,
so how does that work?
So Pacifica is one of the many nonprofit housing providers that get some of its funding from BC Housing. It offers a range of housing in Greater Victoria and Nanaimo, including 250 units of supportive housing and 37 properties, apartments or townhouses, that offer either affordable market rentals or subsidized housing where rent is geared to the tenant's income. Most of it is offered through operating contracts it has with BC Housing. And Ibarra says that adds up to about 50% of its budget. Now, she says each year they submit a budget to BC Housing, and then, especially with older buildings, because there can be unexpected costs, for example, burst pipes, other things, they report back at the end of the year to say how much they spent and how much more they spent than expected, what sort of shortfall they had, and BC Housing covers it. Except BC Housing is behind on both of those things. Ibarra says they still don't have this year's budget approved, even though the fiscal year is more than half over.
Right.
And they reported a $700,000 shortfall for 2022. They just got money back last week. This is a 2022 shortfall.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But it was half of what they said they needed, and there was no explanation of why they didn't get the rest.
Okay, and what's the impact of all of this?
Well, Ibarra says that it means they have to be really careful about the money that they do spend, because they don't actually know how much they have to work with, and they don't know how much they might end up getting back. So they do maintenance that is required. They deal with emergencies like burst pipes, but she says there's a couple of things that happen. They can't do the kind of capital upgrades that would help extend the life of a building, things like roof maintenance, and they can't do renovations to individual units, whether that is new flooring or new cupboards, general upgrades, or accessibility changes like Sandra and David need, things that would help tenants stay in their units if or when they lose mobility. And then, of course, there is the impact on people looking for homes. Here's Carolina.
And then the people who are impacted the most are those who don't have adequate housing or affordable housing at all, because they're stuck on a wait list while units are sitting empty, waiting for funding approval to be renovated. And they can sit waiting for those approvals for months. And once the approval comes in, we have to do the work.
Ibarra says Pacifica has 12 units sitting empty right now because they're waiting to be renovated. 8 are rent geared to income units where tenants pay 30% of their income, no matter what their income was. And some of those are family units, Gregor, and you've had enough housing conversations to know that 3-bedroom apartments in particular are so hard to come by. So a few of those sitting empty. The other units are in a supportive housing building, so 4 units. And as we also know, especially from talking to Carolina in particular, there are people looking for homes in the city who need supportive housing, and there's 4 sitting empty.
Okay, so that's all a really good explanation of what's happening. Did you get any sense, Catherine, of why this is happening now?
You know, Carolina Ibarra says in her experience, it has always been this slow to get compensation and sign off from BC Housing. She's been with Pacifica 4 years, but before that was with a nonprofit housing provider in Vancouver. But she says the big difference now is because of inflation, everything costs more. So it's even harder to risk spending money that you don't know yet will be covered by BC Housing. And she actually was a little bit reluctant to talk about this, especially given that it's not a new phenomenon. She brought it up when we spoke in December, but wasn't quite ready to speak publicly because, of course, she needs BC Housing. She needs their help and she doesn't want to upset them. But she also says that a lot of people there are doing really great work. She says the frontline staff really work hard to get stuff done, especially when the sign-off finally comes for renovations, to make sure that it can happen really quickly. And she says that they're doing great work building new housing. But she just says that even though they feel like their concerns are being heard, the change just isn't happening enough. And she says that the agency is reviewing how it works, but while it does that, people still need housing and money still needs to flow.
And so BC Housing is still building new housing, though, right?
They definitely are, and Ibarra acknowledges that and applauds that. But she says she is worried that because of troubles maintaining older housing stock, those new buildings won't necessarily actually be net new housing. They will just replace existing housing. For example, I mentioned those 4 supportive units that are sitting empty. They're sitting in an 18-unit building that Pacifica owns, but has operated as supportive housing on behalf of BC Housing. BC Housing actually hasn't renewed that operating contract, which Ibarra says that means they may need to close the building. They also have another supportive housing building that needs renovations, and they're still figuring out whether they can do those reservations with the tenants in or whether they'll need to go elsewhere. All of that means that we could be facing a short-term loss of supportive housing in Victoria. Here's Carolina Ibarra again.
And in the meantime, just our outreach team has a list of 40 homeless people solely in Victoria that we're trying to get housed, and most of them need supportive housing. And so it's an excruciating decision trying to figure out for our teams how we balance that. We empty 2 buildings, and what are we, how do we move people? How do we honor the people who need housing in the best way with this shortage and the upcoming shortage? I think 56%, we have just under 200 supportive housing units. 56% are in question as to whether they will continue operational over in the next 2 years.
So again, that's Carolina Ibarra with Pacifica Housing.
Okay, so that sounds like a difficult situation. And so how does BC Housing, or what does BC Housing have to say about this, Catherine?
Well, in an emailed response to my questions, a spokesperson said that with the changing and growing need for housing in this province, BC Housing does need to change its processes, and it is working on doing that. It did say that it has begun to look at Pacifica's budget for 23-24, so the fiscal year that will end soon. They're starting to look at that budget now. It also says it is reviewing requests for Pacifica for renovation funding, and it said it has offered them an advance and that they meet regularly to provide updates. Now, I checked in on that advance with Carolina Ibarra. She confirmed that both BC Housing and the Housing Ministry have offered funding advances or been speaking about funding advances since before December, but that Pacifica made some requests for such advances, provided information to back up why they might need those advances, and so far they haven't been granted them, as the agency is asking for additional information and kind of keeps coming back to them asking for more. Now, regarding the supportive housing building that Carolina Ibarra mentioned, one she says that the BC Housing hasn't renewed the operating contract for. BC Housing says it is looking to see what can be done with the site to make sure that everyone living there still